We'll be looking at Acts chapter 13, verse 22, and then we'll be looking at 1 Samuel 13 through 14, and some other passages as well. And the title of the message this morning is A Man After God's Own Heart. A Man After God's Own Heart. Three preachers got together, and they went fishing. And they were there for a while, and out in the boat, and one of them said, I think I need some more bait. So he got out of the boat and he walked across the water and walked over to the land and went to his car and he got some bait. And pretty soon the second one, he said, you know what? He says, I think I need some more Cokes. So he got out of the boat and he walked across the water. And he walked over to his car and he got some more Cokes. And he brought them back to the car. Well, the third preacher, this was his first time with them. And all this time he's starting to think, what is it these guys? They can walk on water? If they've got that much faith that they can walk on water, I know I can do it too. And so pretty soon he says, well, you know what? He says, I just realized that I need to get back to the car. He says, because I forgot. And I've got to go back and get my keys because somebody's liable to steal my car if I just leave it there. So he got out and he started to walk and he went zoop right down in the water. And he got up and got back in the boat and he said, if they can do it, I can do it. And he stepped out of the boat again. And zip, down he went. The other two looked at each other and they said, you know what? We better tell him where the rocks are or he's going to drown. Too many people in this world are drowning because they don't know where the rocks are. They don't know where Jesus is. They don't. We're going to look at a man after God's own heart. We live in a world where everyone insists on stating his own opinion about everything. People believe that they've got the right to do it, and nobody's going to stop me. And the results of this rights movement is seen throughout our society. Popular opinion just dominates every facet of our lives. It has its roots in the media, and it permeates into everything from politics to religion. We even had a president, at least one president, who made some of his decisions based on public opinion polls rather than on what he thought was right. Our forefathers believed that the very best system of government was a democratic form of government where the majority rules. And that was fine for them because of the milieu in which they wrote the Constitution. That is, the environment which influenced them was so different from the environment that influences us today. The environment that influenced their thinking was the fact that they believed that they needed to do what was right in the sight of God. That was number one, not what was popular opinion. And those first fathers of ours, those first presidents, they followed that. And they followed it carefully. Those very same principles. So this morning, we want to look at a man whom God said was a man after his own heart. A man whose only opinion, to him, the only opinion that mattered was God's opinion and not people's opinion. He didn't care what people thought. Let's look at some of the testimonies about King David. Acts chapter 13, verse 22, the Apostle Paul cited 1 Samuel 13 through 14 when he said, after removing Saul had been king, he made David their king. He testified concerning him, I have found David, son of Jesse, a man after my own heart. He will do everything I want him to do. And let's also read 1 Samuel 13 through 14, from which that was taken. And it briefly describes God's rejection of Saul and his choice of Saul's successor. He says, "You acted foolishly." Samuel said, "You have not kept the command the Lord your God gave you. If you had, he would have established your kingdom over Israel for all time. But now your kingdom will not endure. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart and appointed him leader of his people, because you have not kept the Lord's command." Then in 1 Samuel chapter 16 and verse 7, God tells us why he chose David rather than anyone else. It's because the Lord does not look at the things man looks at. Man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. And this is the key that tells us what makes a king in God's sight. The heart of God's king. Let's look. Now listen, make no mistake. When God selected Saul, he selected the very best that there was. It was the best choice of all the people that lived in his day. Physically, he was attractive to the people because he was a head taller than all of the other Israelites. And spiritually, he was better because he was humble. At first, he was humble. The problem was that the office of kingship went to his head, and his ego grew and grew and grew, and he not only overstepped the boundaries that were his by performing the duties that God had given to the priests and not to the king, the duties of offering sacrifices to God. He not only did that, which he shouldn't have, but he also disobeyed God's instructions about sparing the life of the Amalekite king, Agag. And by allowing his men to disobey God by not destroying all of the livestock of the Amalekites that they had taken. People, even kings, have a tendency to second-guess God, to question God's judgment, and to make decisions for themselves no matter what God says. That's the world that we live in. That's the world we live in. That's what King Saul did. And as a result, his family lost control of the throne. David and his descendants became the rulers of Israel. The house of David displaced the house of Saul. Now, David didn't usurp the throne. He didn't grab the power of the king. God made the change. God took the kingship from Saul and from his descendants, and he gave it to David and his descendants. Saul lost the kingship because of heart failure. And it wasn't physical heart failure. It was spiritual heart failure. He allowed his ego to take over his thinking, and consequently it took over his actions. He allowed his opinions, his thinking, his beliefs to overshadow God's commands. And it says, in doing this, he acted foolishly. Foolishly. You see, he did what he thought was best in his own eyes, rather than doing what God said. Now, Saul's problem wasn't just disobedience, but we'll get to some of that in a few moments. First, let's look at why David had a heart after God's heart. Again, both kings began their reigns with the right heart. They were both humble. They were both obedient to God's word, and they both waited on the Lord. Saul was made king, but he waited on the Lord. Right after being anointed as king, you know what he did? He went home and he started farming. He was there plowing. He was waiting for the Lord to call him to leadership. He waited on the Lord. And then the word came. And he took the reins of leadership and he led the people. And he did well at first. But then he began to think too much for himself and of himself. And the next thing you know, the kingdom slipped from him. David was anointed to be the next king. But he was anointed while Saul was still living. And he had to wait for years for God to make him king. And he did wait. And as he waited, he refused to grab the throne by killing Saul, even though he had the opportunity to do so at least twice. The point is that a heart after God's heart is first and foremost humble. And it is secondly patient. And it waits on the Lord. Like it says in Psalm 27:14, wait for the Lord, be strong and take heart, and wait for the Lord. In his early years, King Saul waited for the Lord. But later he became impatient and he panicked when he saw his army dwindling away as people began to leave because they were getting tired of waiting for Samuel to come. And Samuel was supposed to come and to offer the sacrifice because Samuel was the priest. And so Saul decided he'd take things into his own hands. And he decided that he would offer the sacrifice himself. And he did. And no sooner had he offered the sacrifice than guess who showed up? Samuel. And Samuel had a few choice words for Saul. And he let him know that right then and there, the kingdom was being taken away from him and given to someone else. You see, that's what God did. He took the kingship from Saul and his family and gave it to David forever. The kingship didn't change David like it did Saul. He remained humble and he waited on the Lord no matter what. Now, having a heart after God's own heart meant more than just being humble and patient. For David, it involved other factors. Factors that didn't become clear until Solomon, David's son, became king. And when Solomon became king, there are several statements made about David. And we want to look at those. When God appeared to Solomon in a dream in 1 Kings chapter 3 and verse 6, Solomon said, you have shown, talking to God, you have shown great kindness to your servant, my father David, because he was faithful to you and righteous and upright in heart. You have continued this great kindness to him and have given him a son to sit on the throne this very day. How was David's heart described? It's described as being faithful and righteous and upright. You know, even when David sinned, David remained faithful. His allegiance was always to the living God. He was loyal. Unlike Solomon, David's son, David never pursued other gods, and Solomon did. David also had a heart that was righteous and upright. And these two words kind of are synonyms of one another. And they mean behaving in a moral and honorable manner. Such a heart behaves respectably. David not only behaved respectably, he was a highly principled man. His own men couldn't understand why David didn't kill King Saul, especially when they were in that cave together. The opportunity was there. David creeped up behind him, cut off part of his garment, and later showed it to Saul himself. But the point was, he would not take Saul's life. They didn't understand why not. Why not? But David wouldn't. Why? Because he was principled. And a part of his principles were, you do not touch God's anointed. You do not touch God's anointed. So David didn't kill Saul. Now, the Amalekite, who claimed to have killed Saul later on, Saul had been wounded in battle, and he tried to get his armor bearer to run his sword through him, but he wouldn't do it. And so Saul himself decided to fall on his own sword, and he killed himself. Then an Amalekite came by and saw what had happened, and he ran to David and told David, hey, I killed Saul. I ran him through with a sword. He's thinking, boy, I'm going to get me a reward. And he did. The punishment for doing such a thing was, David condemned him. The death sentence was pronounced upon him, and he was run through with a sword. Not only this, but that same kind of principle was there later, when a little fellow by the name of Rechab and his buddy Baanah decided that, hey, Ishbosheth doesn't need to be king anymore. David needs to be our king. So they snuck up and got him while he was sleeping, and they cut his head off, and they took it to David, and they thought, boy, we're going to get a reward. We're going to get some good places in the kingdom. And what happened? The principled David passed judgment on them, and they were put to death. David took no stock in murdering people. He took no stock in being unprincipled. His morality or his morals were very high, and he was high. That didn't mean he didn't sin, and we'll talk about his sin in a minute. But the point is that he remained humble, and he remained patient, and he, indeed, was a man of honor. And you know, not only did his men not understand him, his own wife didn't understand him. Michal, she couldn't understand him. And he embarrassed her when he was dancing in front of the Ark of the Covenant, when he was bringing it into Jerusalem. And apparently he had taken off his royal cloak and was dancing in front of everyone. And she chastised him for it. And that's not a kingly way to act. And he said, oh, yes, it is. He says, I'll dance before those maidens anytime I want to, because I'm dancing for the Lord and not for you. She didn't understand. She didn't understand David's sense of duty and loyalty to God. She had her own thoughts. And you know what? We live in a world that tries to tell Christians how they should live and how they should react. And we shouldn't worry about what they tell us, because they don't know. And they don't know what it is to be truly honorable. To be truly honorable. Heart after God's own heart is faithful, righteous, and upright. And later in 1 Kings chapter 9, verses 4 through 5, God said to Solomon, as for you, if you walk before me in integrity of heart and uprightness, as David your father did, and do all I command and observe my decrees and laws, I will establish your royal throne over Israel forever, as I promised David your father when I said, you shall never fail to have a man on the throne of Israel. How does God describe him here? He describes him as a man with a heart of integrity, a man who is upright, a man who is not only honorable and not only does the honorable thing, but he's honest about it all, and he's open. David doesn't hide a thing. He ignored something. He ignored several things, and it got him in trouble. But the point was, he was open with God. He was open with God. We need to be open with God. You know, this integrity is often a synonym of upright, except that it has that addition of honesty, honor, and reliability attached to it. David had a heart of integrity, and Psalm 78:72 confirms that when it says, and David shepherded them with integrity of heart. 1 Kings 11:4 gives us one more insight into David's heart. As Solomon grew old, his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God, as the heart of David his father had been. David had a fully devoted heart, fully devoted to God. Not to men, not to men's opinions, but to God. Fully devoted to Him. That's the way David's heart was. And people didn't understand it. Now there's one more issue that demonstrates the sincerity of David's heart. And it has to do with sin. Sin in David's life. You see, David did sin. He did disobey God's law. Saul sinned and David sinned. What happened when Saul sinned? When Saul sinned, it says this, when Samuel confronted him about his sin, what did he do? He lied about it. He lied about it. He says, I did do what I was supposed to do. And then he blamed others. Those men, I was afraid of them. They made me do it. He refused to take responsibility for his own wrongdoing. That was Saul's big downfall. And how did David respond when confronted about his sin by the prophet Nathan? He acknowledged his sin. And he said, I have sinned against you, God. And in fact, he says, I have sinned only against you, God. That was the emphasis that he placed, and an understanding in his heart. God, I let you down. I sinned. I have done wrong. He acknowledged his sin, and he repented of his sin, and he accepted the penalty of his sin. And the penalty of his sin was that the child died. The child that Bathsheba was bearing that belonged to David died. But David accepted that. And he accepted it in a way that even the elders of Israel didn't understand, because he mourned and he cried and he didn't eat and he begged God to save the child's life while the child was still alive and was dying. And he prayed and he pleaded and he didn't stop. Then the child died. And David washed himself and he got dressed and he started eating. And somebody said, what's going on here? Why are you acting this way? The child died. He said, yes. But listen, I can't bring the child back. He'll never come back to me. But I can go to him. And that was the way that David thought. That was the way he thought. Need to recognize sin in our own lives sometimes. we have to own up to our own actions. We have to own up to what we do. We can't blame anyone else for anything. We can't blame our circumstances. We can't blame life. We can't run around throwing pity parties saying, woe is me because I was born into a bad family, or a pity party, life just hasn't been good for me. Oh yeah, life has been awful and people do wrong to me all the time. Oh yes they do. And we run around and we blame everyone else. But that's not a person after God's own heart. David was a man after God's own heart. And you know, there's another unique thing about David. David, in Psalm 25, verses 6 and 7, he says, remember, O Lord, your great mercy and love, for they're from of old. Remember not the sins of my youth and my rebellious ways. According to your love, remember me, for you're good, O Lord. Now I want you to notice something. He asked God not to remember the sins of his youth and his rebellious ways. Now listen, it's highly unlikely that David is talking about when he was a little kid, because he knew that God didn't hold him responsible for those things he did as a little kid. But he's talking about his youth. The youthful days when he was first king, the foolish mistake he made with Bathsheba, the foolish mistakes he made with his own children, those were his sins. And those were stuck with him. And he asked God not to remember them, but to forget them, to forgive them. And you know, when God forgives, he forgets. He's not like people. Have you ever heard someone say, I'll forgive you, but I'll never forget it? They're not forgiving. They're really not forgiving at all. They want to hold on to it. Because, you see, it's a big old rolling pin that they can hit you with anytime. So they hold on to it. But he says, don't do that. Don't do that. God doesn't. David was a man after God's own heart. He really was. Why? Because he was a man of integrity. He was a man of honesty. He was a man of honor. He was a man who was upright. Yes, he was a man who sinned like all of us. But when he sinned, he owned up to his own sin. And he acknowledged it, and he asked God's forgiveness. Listen, all of us are sinned. All of us have fallen short of the glory of God. And all of us need forgiveness. And that's what Jesus Christ offers us. That's what he gives us. The forgiveness of sin. And when Jesus forgives your sin, he forgets it. Never to be brought up again. He won't beat you over the head with it 5 years down the road. It's over. So the question is, how can I have a heart like David? How can I have a heart that's truly a heart after God's own heart? Well, we can do it by doing exactly what David did. And what did David do? David was a man of integrity of heart. David was a man who waited on the Lord. David was a man who remained humble to the end. David, oh yes, David sinned. But when he did, he owned up to it and he asked for forgiveness. And that's what we need to do. That's what we need to do. We're going to have an invitation hymn this morning. The call is